Hey y'all, welcome to the Coyote Trapping School podcast. I'm your host, Chris Pope, and today we're going to continue our discussion around starting a wildlife control business. And we're going to start the next couple episodes are going to be about pricing. So I hope this resonates. I hope y'all are enjoying this series and the interviews that we've had. I'm getting a lot out of it, just kind of going back through and rehashing and thinking about these things a little bit more. So give me some feedback. Shoot me an email, Chris, K-R-I-S, at coyotetrappingschool.com. Let me know what you think. Let me know if there's any specific questions that you have. So before we get started, of course, we've got to thank our sponsors, Kott's Bros Lures. Now is the time. In fact, I was just texting with a buddy of mine that's been dipping his traps, getting his traps ready. And now's the perfect time. And I always say that I'm going to be better about getting my stuff done ahead of time, and I need to practice what I preach and get my traps cleaned up and finished too. But to do that, you got to get your supplies, whether you're dyeing, dipping, waxing, full metal jacketing, whatever you're doing. Go to CottsBrosLures.com. They can get you set up with all your trap treatment options, get your lures and baits, any new traps or stakes that you need, they'll get you all fixed up. So definitely, let me turn this on. Let me put this on silent. But definitely appreciate them supporting the podcast, supporting the show, supporting what we do as trappers. And so be sure to show our support for them supporting us by buying something, if that makes sense. Also, if you're in need of any kind of beaver tail products, mainly wallets, is what I've been working on lately. But here's one that I got handy, made from your beaver tails or mine to help support the trapping industry. Again, let me know. Hit me up. I've got I'm getting some stuff, actually a shipment today that I'm going to be trying some trifold wallets. So I've got a lot of questions about trifold wallets. Currently, I offer the front pocket wallet, what I showed you, a bifold, and a roper style wallet. I've tried a couple of trifolds, and I haven't been satisfied with them yet, but I keep getting questions about them. So I'm going to give this other scenario a shot. I think it's gonna turn out good. So I'll keep you posted on that. But hit me up, shoot me a message, email, whatever, and I can get you information about that, ordering that. So with that, we will get into the discussion. This actually kind of all centers around an article that I got from a friend of mine. He sent me a message. Hey, it was sometime last year, and it was a picture, and he said, "Man, I swear this looks just like you." And I opened it and looked at it. And, wait a minute, that is me. And he sent me this. This is a picture when I was actually working with the USDA Wildlife Services, trapping in South Georgia. That was the summer after I graduated with my wildlife degree. So I worked for a short term with USDA, then actually wound up going back to school and getting my forestry degree. But yeah, he sent me that picture, and I was like, man, what the heck? And I was asking him about it, and he said, I'll just send you the magazine. So this is actually an article out of the Journal of Wildlife Trends Journal, Practical Wildlife Management Information. And I'll include a link to the journal and all in the show notes below. But this is an article called "The Cost of Nest Predator Trapping for Bobwhite Quail" by David Sisson, and it's centers all around mainly the Southwest Georgia area, which is big time quail country and plantation country. And that was actually where I was trapping when I was. That's exactly what I was doing. I was trapping quail plantations. And the interesting thing about that is I guess, a very old money type area, and that's it's all privately held, large tracts, and they're managed. Very few of them are actually commercially managed for hunts. It's all strictly for the families that own them, and realistically, it's people that are down there, a handful of weeks a year, maybe. But they've got these incredible spreads of land that are immaculately managed. They've got a full staff. They've got housing. It's a really neat place to be around, and really kind of honestly hard to wrap your head around. Somebody that's spending a lot of money and is not expecting any kind of monetary return from it, and is not even there the majority of the time that they own it. So so that's what this is about. Now that's it's a little bit I was going to say it's a little bit of a unique scenario, but it's not really, because these may be a little bit larger than some of the other properties across the South, or across the South, because you get out west and there's big properties, but there's still a fair number of people around that own property for recreational use, and they may not be managing it for quail, but they may be managing it for deer or turkeys or things like that, and that are spend a lot of money. They're willing to hire trappers to as long as they feel that they are getting a benefit from the service we provide. And so that's a thing, going back to Stephen Mantassel's interview and some of the future shows, is if you're interested in wanting to get into this wildlife control business, you've got to be a salesman. You gotta throw your trapper hat out the window, because you don't get to be a trapper unless you can sell people on why they need your service and why they need to pay you for your service. And so we're going to get into the nitty gritty a little bit of some thoughts on how you may consider charging. Now I may should have done these flip flop, but the next episode, I'm going to show you an Excel spreadsheet. If you are interested in it, email me and I'll be happy to email it to you. But it's a way that you can figure out what it's a good template guideline for you to at least give you a starting point for what you should charge, because there's a lot of stuff. The more I sat down and as I was building it out, and I'd get it done, I'm like, all right, that's pretty good. And I'd come back a couple of days and I'm like, well, I need to add this and this and this. And we really, as not business owners, but as trappers, we don't realize all of the costs that go into what we do. And so I think this is going to really help to open your eyes as far as what all it does take to catch a squirrel in an attic, or a coyote on a plantation, or whatever. So we'll get into that next time. In this one, this is it's a really informational article, and I don't know that there's anywhere that you can go and read the article, but look up hit the link below to the Wildlife Trends Journal and check out what they got, because it may be something that you're interested in. They got a wide variety. I don't know that there's a table of contents in here, but anyway, they got, I guess it's here. They got a article on regenerating deer dirt, your lake shoreline, the feral hog dilemma, and then a Wildlife Trends Journal management calendar. So, if you're a landowner or manager, this may be a good resource for you. It's not something that I was familiar with until I got sent this. So, this data comes from a series of surveys. So they, David Sisson and the group that put this together, they came up with a 42 question survey and distributed it to plantation managers across this area, which was primarily southwest Georgia, a little bit North Florida, a little bit Alabama, and then also Carolinas, just to kind of get a good, a good representation across the board as far as how these management costs may change or vary, just kind of get a good average. So they got 43 surveys returned, representing over 258,000 acres of managed quail land. So remember, this is specifically for quail, but the pricing guidelines, it's managed for quail, but it's predator removal, across the board predator removal, which is applicable to deer, turkeys, whatever. So the properties ranged in size from 1,100 acres to 29,000 acres. The average property size was 6,000 acres. All properties that completed the survey had a trapping program in place, and they had a trapping program in place for an average of 15 years. So this, in this area, the trapping program is, it's kind of historical. It's known that it has value, and it's not really questioned, I guess, that we're going to have a trapping program. So they get into the seasons. So in general, they either got two categories. Property, they said roughly half of the properties were trapped year round, and then half of the properties were trapped seasonally. And when they're talking about seasonally, they're talking about the quail breeding season, and bobwhite breeding season after burning. So style, and one thing that's a little bit different about this, and one thing that I had some exposure when I was down there, is they use a combination of box traps, cage traps, and foothold traps. So they said 26%, 69% of the properties used both box traps and foothold traps. 26% used only box traps, and 5% used only leg hold traps. And actually, in most cases, box traps were more frequently used than footholds, but the managers usually stated that leg hold traps were very effective and box traps were only moderately effective. So some of this data comes from properties that were managing the trapping program in-house, and some of it comes from properties that were managing the trapping program through contractors. So my guess is the ones that are managing stuff in-house may have been a little bit more heavy to the box traps and cage traps, just because of the ease of use and ease of setting. One of the real interesting parts that I thought was they talked about the effort. And so all this stuff is fairly, I guess, fairly well documented so far as what they the trap set and all that. So trapping density averaged 1 trap per 46 acres of managed land. So about 20 to 25 traps per 1,000 acres, which makes sense. I mean, that'd be a dozen traps for 500 acres. That's especially on a longer term. If you're just trapping for a short couple weeks, you probably get heavier on that. And that's something too that plays into the cost. Let me make a note of that. Because more traps takes you more time, right? Which can limit the amount of time that you're on other properties, which, depending on how you structured your work, limits your daily rate. So trapping was typically conducted by a combination of in-house employees and contractors, 51%, or solely by in-house employees. So this is where it gets a little bit muddy for me, because it says conducted by a combination of in-house employees and contractors, or solely by in-house employees. So I don't know if in some of the cases, maybe a contractor is, a professional trapper is coming in and setting traps, and then some of the in-house employees are checking them throughout the week, to try to limit cost, or maybe the trapper's availability, or what. But as we get in here, so most contract trapping lasts between 2 and 15 weeks during the bobwhite breeding season. And this is kind of the meat. This is what you're looking for, or what I was looking for. The average contractor weekly rate was $1,405, or a per animal bounty of $20 to $25. So when you break out $1,405, that's $200 a day. And frankly, what I'm going to tell you is, when we look at our overhead sheet, $200 a day ain't cutting it. But when you factor in that, you're only checking 2 dozen traps per 1,000 acres. So if you're on a smaller property, you may be able to be hitting multiple properties at one time. Or maybe in some cases that's a trapper that gets the line set up, and maybe the trapper only comes and checks the traps every 3 days, and the employees, the plantation employees, maybe are checking them the other days. And so you can almost kind of get a real long line scenario, kind of what you see with the guys out west. They may have 3 trap lines out, but because they only have to check them once every 3 days, they can run a different line every 3 days and help keep things more productive. Although, most of these, I'm sure all these states have got a 24-hour trap check law. So as long as you've got a licensed trapper checking the traps, then, or a landowner possibly, but a licensed trapper would be the safest thing. So as long as you got a licensed trapper checking the traps, then you can maintain your productivity. So if you're charging that $200 a day, but you're hitting 6 plantations, because you could realistically, depending on the size, I mean, a 6,000 plus acre plantation, you're probably not going to cover 2 of those in a day. But if you're trapping, two 1,500 to 2,000 acre plantations, um, you could probably cover 2 of those a day fairly easily. Now on those days too, if somebody else is checking the traps, they're probably not resetting, so you can have more time. But regardless, so if you got a line where you could catch 6, and I may be a little optimistic. I hope y'all are following. I hope I'm not getting too off in the weeds, but if you could trap 6 2,000 acre plantations all at one time, that's $200 a day. That's $1,200 a day. That starts to make more sense, right? Well, we'll see. That definitely off the cuff definitely seems like it's making more sense. So it's all in how you manage it and how you work it, and making sure you're staying legal with whatever you're doing. But I did think that was kind of interesting, that $1,405 weekly rate. That gives you some kind of ballpark, some kind of idea. And it also lists a per animal bounty. I'm not a fan of per animal bounties, just because you can't control wild animals. You may not know everything that's taking place on the property, so you may have some rogue guy that's coming through and setting poison baits or something. I mean, you get into some rural areas, you hear all kinds of stuff going on, and so if somebody came through and put out some kind of strychnine carcasses or something like that, and you go through there and you're busting your tail trying to catch everything, and you're not seeing any sign, and you come up with no catches, you don't get paid, and you've put time and effort into that. And then you've got weather that plays in. I mean, there's so many different things. I understand and appreciate the idea of being paid based on results. That's definitely something that I get and I appreciate, but I don't like a per animal system. That's just my opinion. I don't think that has the potential to value what we bring to the table as trappers. Just my 2 cents. Then they get into baits. So a wide variety of baits were used. They separated them into 3 categories: visual, scent-based, and a combination of the 2. Most properties, 64%, used a combination of visual and scent baits in their trapping programs. And it has a special note in here. Several managers commented that the longevity of their baits related to resistance to ants. And that's if you trap in the South, even if you trap in the South in the winter, but more so if you try to trap in the South in the spring and summer, ants are your nemesis. And so I think that is one upside to using cages, because in my experience, when I was trapping down there, when we used cages, when we set cages, we used eggs, whole eggs. The good thing about eggs is visual. You leave them for a while in the heat, in the 90, 100 degree heat, they're going to get a smell to them. And as long as they don't crack, ants can't get in them. And so that is a huge plus. And I think that's one of the main drivers behind, most people most trappers don't think of box traps or cage traps as a viable long line option. But I think because of the ants and the ability to kind of control the baits that you use, I think that may be why there is a little bit more emphasis on the box traps, cage traps in this scenario. So it's just some food for thought. Those are more expensive. You can't get as many in your truck, but if you can keep those traps working and keep your catches going, then there's definitely the trade-off there. So here's the interesting part of catch rate. Average catch rate was 1.3% per night. So that averaged 1 animal per 17 acres. Now that is not a lot of doing, right? I mean, that's an animal out of 100 traps every night. That's not something that gets trappers excited. But you've got to remember, it's kind of a twofold thing. One, these properties have been trapped historically for an average of 15 years. So the population's already suppressed. And 2, that's your goal. So as one of my trapping mentors told me, success is boring. So if you're not catching many predators, then you're probably doing your job. and that's what the landowner wants to see. And so that's kind of another one of those fine lines on managing the expectations of the landowner, the client, is if you're not catching any animals, it could look like you're not may not be doing your job. But I'm trying to think of how I can say this the way I was thinking about it in my head. Um, they're not wanting many animals to be present as well, and especially if you're the one that's been doing the trapping program historically, then there's then that's the goal, right? That's what you're after. I mean, from these guys' perspective, ideally they want no predators. They want you to come in every year and trap and catch nothing because you've already caught everything and it's all gone. So it's interesting that they talk about, most contract trapping lasts between 2 and 15 weeks. Now, 15 weeks is a long time to be on a property, but here they say we start to see a diminishing rate of return after properties reach 17 trap nights per acre. So that's your spot, which is, a lot of trappers, I would say, target just even from a fur perspective, hitting an area for 2 weeks and moving on. That gives you enough time to catch a couple of the coyote cycles, and then most of the smaller animals that don't travel as much are going to be caught in that initial trapping session anyway. So your initial time frame. So that makes sense that after about 17 days you're going to start seeing your catches tail off anyway. And of course that varies. If you've got a new property that hasn't been trapped, you're going to have a better catch rate. But again, if you are doing the trapping and selling a trapping year over year, or the trap property has been trapped, you keep that in mind. You've got less to start with anyway. So possums and raccoons made up over 70% of the annual catch. That's not surprising, especially for trappers. Armadillos, coyotes, bobcats, and foxes making up only 20%, and 5% being considered other. So 3/4 of what you're catching is possums and raccoons. That's not the glory animals, the coyotes, bobcats, and foxes that trappers and some landowners want to see. But I would suggest that those are probably the heavier nest predators. One, because obviously they've got a higher density, and they may target fewer other things, if that makes sense. Coyotes and bobcats may be a little bit more opportunistic. Especially bobcats, they may be more opportunistic about nest predation, whereas raccoons and possums, they're looking for eggs every day they wake up, probably. So one thing that I think is important, if you have the opportunity to try to sell a trapping program like this, they talk about monitoring and a predator index survey, and I really think that is a great way to set the baseline, maintaining your clients' expectations, and also knowing what expectations that you need to live up to. So I need to do an episode about this, but there's a protocol, I guess you could say, for doing these predator surveys. And you take a mixture of mineral oil and sand, mix it up so that it holds a track real well, and you spread it. I think it's supposed to be, it's research term, so it's probably a square meter, but roughly a square yard, 3-foot square. And then you place a scent tablet in the middle of it. And it's kind of like a fish oil based tablet. And you place a scent tablet in the middle of it, and then you check it, daily for a certain length of time, and see what tracks, record the tracks, brush them out, and do it again. And that gives you an idea of the number and species of predators that are on a property. And so let's see. The index is the average number of stations hit per night over the course of a week, and these surveys average 13.4. An index of 20 or higher has recently been shown to impact reproductive output, with surveys on untrapped properties generally higher than those trapped and getting as high as 50 to 70. I thought this was so this is something that I think would be worthwhile to do a little bit more in-depth episode on, and kind of showing the process of doing these predator index surveys. Like I say, just because I run into landowners fairly regular, and it has to do with who's in your area. But that talk about somebody coming in, and I had this guy come in, 6 years ago, and he trapped 80 coyotes off of 500 acres. It's like, man, that didn't happen. But there's folks out there that'll do whatever they need to make a dollar. And it's definitely, when you do this from a business side and you're charging somebody, there's a lot of added pressure. And so there's definitely a need to produce, and I can see where that would encourage some people to inflate their numbers just to look better. That's dumb. That's lying. That's not acting with integrity, which I think all of us trappers should. But it also gives all the other trappers a black eye. So, I had this guy come in and catch 70 coyotes in 14 days last year. Well, the only way I'm going to do a trapping program for you is if I can do a survey. And that's the other thing, is how do you incorporate that cost into your trapping program? Because it's going to cost you to go out and do this survey. And that's not going to be days that you're trapping. So, all that again goes back to how you sell and how you propose, what you're offering. But I definitely think that is something, I definitely think that's something that a lot of managers would value too, is, knowing the number of predators on the property, knowing the predator index. And, and I'll look up this research, but, being able to show, maybe that's a selling point, is, listen, we'll do this predator index, and based on that, we'll decide the level of trapping and the intensity of trapping. Because, if this says an index of 20 or higher has recently been shown to impact reproductive output, and I'm assuming that's reproductive output of your prey species, so your deer, quail, turkeys maybe. And so, if they're showing 50, I'm sorry because I don't really know what these numbers mean. I should have looked this up. But if they're showing 50, which would be exceptionally high, definitely could be impacting the prey species that are the landowner's target species. Yes, this is going to be the trapping program. But if you're showing 15, maybe we don't need to have a trapping program this year. Maybe we need to do it every other year. That's impacting you as a trapper, because that's one job that you may not get. But I think in the long term, that's more of a relationship you're going to build. And you can also, you got to figure out how you're going to charge for that, the predator survey, because that's a service in itself, right? Hey, you spend, $1,000 on this predator survey, you might not need to spend $6,000 on a trapping program this year. So that's something to think about. Hit that for a while. They talk about, they get into a section about telemetry and the cost of telemetry versus non-telemetry, I guess. And obviously the cost, and it's talking about several of the options like Skyhawk, and there's a few other ones that are, it's solely cage trap related, but that'll tell you when a trap is fired. And this is something that haven't been toying with, but I've been thinking a lot about lately, just from a nuisance trapping aspect in general. Because a couple weeks ago I was doing a skunk job, knew the skunk was underneath the house. I saw the skunk underneath the house, sealed off the exits, put some traps on the underside where I thought was the only way that he could get out. Well, that first day, the skunk, the first day I set traps on the outside. The second day I came back, set traps on the inside, and I caught the skunk on the inside. I should have done that to start with. But, either way, I could have, and especially if you got potential repeat catches, I could have had either a trap monitor there or a cell phone camera that takes a picture, as long as that's considered legal in your state as checking the trap. And that could have saved me a 60-mile round trip, So I think there's definitely a lot. There's definitely some potential advantages there. To me, I actually wound up just buying another or a cell phone camera for both my hog stuff, my hog trapping stuff, and this other stuff, because at that location I set 3 traps. It's a lot cheaper in the long run to have a cell phone camera that I can check all 3 of those traps with than have a monitor for each trap. Regardless, I think that's something that's worth looking at, because they talk about in here, is you've got a higher investment, but especially where you're running this as a business, and if you can not have dead time or wasted time going to check an empty trap, and instead be productive setting up a new location, then you're coming out ahead in the long run. So one of the other key things here, and I think we're getting close to wrapping this up. I feel like I'm droning on a little bit, but I hope this is all making sense and useful. But it says the average annual operating cost per acre on the surveyed properties was found to be $2.93. And so I was trying to think about this. That may be something that you can use in trying to price a job, right? Just because that's that's may or may not be kind of a standard rate. But you've also got to figure in, because how does that relate? Because that works out to be a flat rate, right? So $2.93 on 1,000 acres is $3,000, right? So it's $3,000. I'm sorry. So that's a flat rate. That doesn't count for whether you spent 2 weeks or 15 weeks trapping there. You spend 15 weeks trapping there at that rate, you going in the hole big time. And at that rate, about 2 weeks is all that makes sense. So I don't have any good advice for you there. I think that's an interesting number, that $2.93. I think it's something to keep in mind as you're maybe looking or thinking about some of these jobs. The one thing that I found this past trapping season is I did a big predator job for a large plantation, is you've got to have a tiered system. So this per acre price makes a lot of sense, because a larger property is going to take you more time to cover, right? Whether that's setting traps, pulling traps, checking traps. 3,000 acre property is going to take you more time than a 500 acre property. And so that's where you get into the, being able to stack locations and jobs and get your daily rate up. Is if you're charging the same rate for a 500 acre property as a 3,000 acre property, you're going in the hole on that 3,000 acre property, because you can't, you may not have time to do 8 other jobs or 3 other jobs or whatever. So that daily rate, or that $1,400 a week that you're charging for that property, and if that's the only property that you can do that $200 a day, you're barely covering expenses at that rate. So I do think, and that's something that I've been trying to put a little bit more thought into, but that I like the idea of that per acre rate, because of how much more intensive, more acres is more intensive, is I guess the best way to say that. All right, so a typical trapping program, this kind of summarizes this. It's some good guidelines: using 20 to 25 traps per 1,000 acres, potentially combination of cage traps and foothold traps. visual and scent attractants, I would think cages and your eggs are going to be good. Managers should expect to catch an animal for every 17 acres, or roughly 60 predators per 1,000 acres. So that gives you a good baseline too. So that's something that I was thinking about. You got to be really careful with guarantees, or maybe targets, and that could also tie into the survey. But if you use that $2.93 an acre, and you got 1,000-acre property, and so maybe and there's going to be some potential risk there too, right? But maybe you tell the landowner that the target is 60 animals. If you could take 60 animals in a 3-week time frame, then this is the price. So that gives you the incentive to get it done quicker. That also gives the landowner something to know that you're targeting. Again, I think doing the predator survey to know whether you really think you can remove 60 animals off of that 1,000 acres, because it's not only what happens, talking about poisons and different things, not only what happens on that property, but your surrounding properties can also have an impact. So anyway, and one last thing that I thought was an important point that they made. So a recent analysis by Tall Timbers, which is a research organization, I don't think they're part of, but in conjunction with generally University of Georgia, revealed an annual management cost on these properties approaching $100 an acre annually, which I said that twice. So that means a trapping program at $3 an acre is 3% of their budget. You think about that. These properties, especially if they've got a manager, if they've got some kind of staff, they're investing a lot of money into these properties, and they're expecting and they know from research that they're getting serious returns depending on what their target is. In this case, quail, off of the predator management program. So they're one of their last sentences here says this essentially nullifies the argument about trapping being cost prohibitive, and points out that the biggest cost may be in doing nothing. So $100 an acre on $1,000 property is $100,000. So is it worth the landowner to get whatever the research, and there's a couple articles I need to hit these as well, but whatever the research may be, a 15% increase, is it worth the landowner $3,000 to see a 15% increase in their quail population, or whatever it may be? That could come into another thing, and I hope I'm not getting too off into the weeds, because my passion in general is wildlife and wildlife management. I mean, that's what I went to school with, and so for me, if I can turn this into more of a holistic management perspective instead of just a trapping program perspective from a business standpoint, if I can convince the landowner to let me do a predator survey, and then decide whether that warrants a trapping program, but then also it's going to be valuable to do maybe a deer survey, or quail or turkey, or whatever the landowner's primary objective is. If they're not tracking that stuff in conjunction, then how are you really knowing if the program is paying off, right? I mean, anecdotally, you removed 60 animals off of your property, and you think you saw 18 extra poults last spring. Maybe or maybe not, and whatever the perspective is, whatever somebody thinks is that's the most important thing, right? But if it swings the other way, listen, I paid you $3,000 last year, and I've got less turkeys than I had last year. Well, do you, or do you just think you do? And so I feel like we covered and went a whole bunch of different directions, but all this ties in together, because it's going to help you be a better salesperson if you can know your targets, know and know the expectation of the landowner, know what your expectation is of the land being willing to produce your the predators, because your production of the predators is going to impact the landowner's um, perspective. And then, is the trapping program actually benefiting? Because if it's not, then um, there obviously needs to be something else done. And all that is stuff that is um, stuff that potentially some of you may be able to offer. You're going to may take some training or education, but um, you know doing a deer survey is just cameras and corn. And there's actually been some research on trying to figure out how to do a deer survey without the corn aspect, because that can kind of bias things a little bit. So just like we learned to trap, we can learn to do other things. And um, in my opinion, all those other things do is help justify what what we're doing, what we're selling, our service, right? So anyway, $2.93 an acre. Average contractor weekly rate $1,405. Average of 1%, average catch rate of 1% per night, with an average one animal per 17 acres caught. And so expectations of roughly 60 predators per 1,000 acres, using 20 to 25 traps per 1,000 acres at $2.90 per acre cost. Those are kind of the highlights of that. That's a lot of stuff. I know we covered a whole gamut of things, but I hope as always, I hope that was beneficial. If you got any questions, let me know. Leave a comment, whatever. I haven't been super great at responding to YouTube comments, but I'm trying to work through that and get caught up. But let me know. And with that, I'll wrap it up. I've drone on long enough. Y'all have a great day, and we'll catch you next time.